This is a lecture on Arthur Schopenhauer's The Vanity and Suffering of Life. In this lecture, we'll look at the relation of pain and pleasure to happiness, as Schopenhauer saw it, and he'll look at animals and the way that animals reveal to us the kind of exaggerated needs and suffering that we experience. He comes to the conclusion that life is a mistake, but he proves this in a way by giving a metaphor that life is like a pendulum which swings from boredom to suffering and then back again. He considers the solution, or at least the proposed solution, of contemplation or the contemplation of art as being either a consolation or an escape from this pendulum, and also suggests the idea that we might adopt a stoical indifference as a way out of this double bind. Ultimately, he doesn't think that they're possible, but this is at least his suggestion. The key questions we need to answer in this reading and in this lecture are: what is the nature of pleasure and pain, and how do they affect us? What's their source? Can pain be eliminated from life? What is boredom really about? Where does it come from? Is it natural, or can we eliminate it? How does our fear of death control us? And who has a better life, us or the animals? Why are human passions so much more severe than the animals? This is really part of the previous question, but the ultimate question is there a way out of this natural condition we find ourselves in, one essentially of torment? So if we begin with the relation of pain and pleasure to happiness, he notices something peculiar about pleasure and pain. Pleasure is largely invisible to us. It's not noticed. We notice it, but compared to pain, which is very strongly felt, really strongly impressed on our senses, it is, by comparison, almost not noticeable. And so sometimes it surprises people to understand that, in Schopenhauer's view, what we think of as good is largely a negative. It's not present to us. It's the extinction of a desire, a hunger, a pain. And what is bad is largely positive, in the sense that it has positive force, it has obviousness, it's palpable. It's the presence of pain or suffering. He also notices that, for the most part, pain is much more painful, much more potent than pleasure is pleasurable, if that makes sense. And so human beings experience pain and pleasure, but not as equal forces. And you could consider, as an example, the feeling of intensity of an animal being eaten versus the animal that's doing the eating. Now, this general fact about experience, he thought, was present if you just look at human history. War, pestilence, plague, trouble, poverty, these are the natural, constant condition of most humans most of the time. And if they pause only very briefly before they continue again. So trouble and pain are the average lot for human beings, at least historically. But his argument doesn't really rest on history, but he does note that. He considers the role of time and boredom in human life and our need to, quote-unquote, kill time, right? We're always trying to either catch up with what we're doing or catch up with the tasks we have, and if we're not under the gun in that respect, and we have time to spare, we get bored. And so in these ways, time kind of makes our lives difficult. And strangely enough, he notices, we actually need torment, strife, sorrow. We need some sort of conflict. We need something going on. We don't need torment, obviously, but we're trying always to escape boredom. And he says, work, worry, toil, and trouble are indeed the lot of almost all men their whole life long. And yet, if every desire were satisfied as soon as it arose, how would men occupy their lives? How would they pass the time? Imagine this race, transported to a utopia, where everything grows of its own accord, and turkeys fly around ready roasted, where lovers find one another without any delay and keep one another without any difficulty. In such a place, some men would die of boredom or hang themselves. Some would fight and kill one another, and thus they would create for themselves more suffering than nature inflicts on them as it is. Thus, for a race such as this, no stage, no form of existence is suitable other than the one it already possesses. The question becomes, well, how should we measure the quality of a life? He says, well, we should measure it not by happiness, by positive happiness, but by a lack of suffering. Happiness, again, is a negative, right? It's the elimination of pain or desire that we already feel. In order to get a further grip on the psychology of human beings, he thinks about animals and what animals reveal about our psychology. He notices that we can see, if we look at the animal world, that animals have a better life than we do. I mean, they're in some ways scavenging for food, fighting each other, trying to survive, and it seems like it's a world that's red in tooth and claw. But if we look at animals, we'll notice that animals and us have the same physical basis for pain and pleasure, but we are much more provoked to strong emotions than the animals are. And these are all to get the same things that we all want, right? Health, food, clothing, reproduction, right? Other needs. What we notice about people is that their passions, their emotions compared to the animals are quite magnified. And so the question becomes, what makes them so much greater than the animals? What causes this sort of amplitude or this exaggeration of emotion in human beings? And he says that thinking is the thing that does it, right? By using our minds to imagine and anticipate, to hope and to fear, we build up emotions and an emotional history that the animal just cannot. We worry about the future, and then we worry that we worry too much. We hope for things that are too far in the future to even be predicted, and then when they don't happen, we're horribly disappointed. The greater our consciousness, in other words, the more the pain, the more the boredom. And this is why, right, the genius suffers the most. We suffer more as well because of the way we react to things, including, importantly, pain. A pain that's repeated for an animal is just the same pain again. But for a person, that pain could become unbearable for lots of psychological reasons, right? They have the pain and then it goes away, but now they're anticipating getting it again. They fear it, right? And they might even be ashamed of being afraid of pain, right? They might say, well, pain is natural. I shouldn't worry about it, but we do. And so we have all of these emotions that pile on one another. Pain, anticipation of pain, fear of pain, shame about anticipation of pain, and so on and so on. So this general portrait of human psychological passions and emotions and their magnification is something that he talks a lot about. And he notices that not only do we experience these things, we actually cultivate the desires which lead to them. So we want things and we deliberately intensify our own cravings, whether that's tobacco or drugs or alcohol or luxuries. We create them and we create the desire for them. Right? They begin to control us rather than being simple goods that we can simply enjoy. So we create cravings for amusement and social success, and those cravings, when they're not fulfilled, mean that we're bored. We long for the fast lane. We long for the fast lane, and whenever we're not in it, we're bored, and we have this horrible boredom, right? So our passions create this social world, and this social world can punish us even more than it rewards us. We're consumed by ambition, by fame, fear of embarrassment. We worry about our appearance. We become anorexic. We become bulimic. We take steroids. We make ourselves sterile with the steroids. We go into careers that we hate in order to make money that we need to be respectable in society. We torment ourselves sexually, right? We go for pure romantic love, even if the person is unattainable or wrong for us. Because we lack realism, maybe we fantasize and we project those fantasies onto the world and then we pursue them. And when we fail to get them, we're miserable. Even death, right? Well, especially death, is something which torments us because we know that it's coming. We think about it, we fear it, we obsess about it. It is the background about which we are too much aware. It's, at least in the back of our minds, and this is a fear, again, that animals just do not have. So what does this tell us? Well, for Schopenhauer, the lesson here is that life itself must be a mistake. And he says that human life must be some kind of mistake is sufficiently proved by the simple observation that man is a compound of needs which are hard to satisfy, and that their satisfaction achieves nothing but a painless condition in which he is only given over to boredom, and that boredom is a direct proof that existence is in itself valueless, for boredom is nothing other than the sensation of the emptiness of existence. For if life is the desire for which our essence and existence consists, possessed in itself a positive value and real content, there would be no such thing as boredom. Mere existence would fulfill and satisfy us. So this is a very interesting argument. He's saying, if life had a meaning, if life had a purpose, or it just had a satisfactory quality, we would never be bored. If nothing was going on, we would simply feel the beauty of existing. But that's not what happens to us. When something is not happening for us, when something is not going, when we don't have something to strive after, we feel bored, and this is a negative feeling. And this is a sign, a proof, he thinks, that existence itself is meaningless or valueless. So the lesson he draws from this, again, is that life must be in vain. We are designed to strive. But striving beings find no lasting satisfaction, and in the end, we die. He says, life itself is a sea full of rocks and whirlpools that man avoids with the greatest caution and care, although he knows that, even when he succeeds with all his efforts and ingenuity in struggling through, at every step he comes near to the greatest, the total, the inevitable, and irremediable shipwreck, indeed, even steers right onto it, namely death. This is the final goal of the wearisome voyage, and is worse for him than all the rocks that he has avoided. So the portrait he's painted here is a pendulum, right? A pendulum from boredom to suffering. Why do we will? Why do we try for things? Well, he says we either lack for something, or if we don't lack anything, we have nothing to try for and we get bored. So you see this alternation. Either we have a need which finds the means for satisfaction and then that results in boredom, or we have a need and we can't find the means for satisfaction and we wind up in frustration, and dwelling on that frustration we find ourselves suffering. Now, boredom seems like a minor thing. It seems like something that we shouldn't worry too much about. But he says you really shouldn't underestimate boredom, because attempts to escape boredom show how our condition as human beings is at all times based in potential despair. We flee from despair by loving others, by seeking social gatherings, by constructing public amusements, by constructing circuses and theaters and video games and all kinds of distractions in order to avoid it. But boredom is the thing we're escaping, and boredom is the better side of the pendulum compared to suffering, and yet it is just really more suffering. So Schopenhauer considers what might be a way out. And he considers the idea that maybe contemplation can get us out of this terrible pendulum. By contemplation, he means disinterested, pure, intellectual knowledge, like the kind that can be found in the experience with a work of art. And he says what might otherwise be called the finest part of life, its purest joy, just because it lifts us out of real existence and transforms us into disinterested spectators of it, is pure knowledge, which remains foreign to all willing, pleasure in the beautiful, genuine delight in art. But because this requires rare talents, it is granted only to extremely few, and even to those only as a fleeting dream. Unfortunately, Most people aren't up to such pleasures. This is his point, right? Most people are incapable of the pleasures of knowledge because they're so given over to willing, to desiring this or that material satisfaction or sensual pleasure, that they can never achieve this kind of contemplative state. So, for example, imagine someone who goes to the zoo and the animal's not doing anything and they're looking at it and they're bored. They have to poke at it or prod it or get it to do something for them. In other words, without some sort of engagement, some sort of involvement, some sort of entertainment, they get bored. And so intellectual contemplation of like the form of the animal or the beauty of nature is just not enough for most people. So we're tormented by many of these desires, the accidents that happen to us because we think maybe they're not necessary and they shouldn't have happened to us and this stings at us. But if we realize, Schopenhauer is saying, that pain is inevitable and it's an essential part of life, we might become more realistic about our condition. This is just not what most people are capable of, he thinks. But it is the key. So perhaps what we should do, he thinks, is try to adopt this kind of contemplative attitude, not maybe about art, but a kind of stoical indifference. He says, if such a reflection were to become a living conviction, it might produce a considerable degree of stoical equanimity and greatly reduce our anxious concern about our own welfare. Because the Stoic realizes that he or she is the real cause of his or her pain. Realizing that pain is a given in life, we might also realize that our nature as individual human beings has more to do with suffering than we thought. You might have noticed that some people suffer greatly over minor misfortunes while other people bear up very well. But notice, after a great pain or a great joy subsides, very frequently our level of general contentment settles back to the way it was before. Our frame of mind, most of the time, is the same, right? There's a set point. So about this idea of a stoical attitude, he says, human cheerfulness or dejection is obviously not determined by external circumstances, by wealth or position, for we come across at least as many cheerful faces among the poor as among the rich. Now, although the degree of our cheerfulness or sadness is not at all times the same, yet in some consequence of this view, we shall attribute it not to the change of external circumstances, but to that of the internal state, the physical condition. But this is a delusion. The measure of our pain and our well-being is, on the whole, subjectively determined for each point of time according to our hypothesis. And in reference to this, that external motive for sadness is only what a blister is for the body, to which we are drawn all the bad humors that would otherwise be spread throughout it. So let's come now to some final questions about the piece and move on to a little bit of a summary. One question I want you to think about is, what does Schopenhauer want us to get out of the piece about human condition and our conditions as individuals? And what can we really expect, realistically respect, in the way of happiness? I think this quote is a nice way that he sums it up towards the end of the piece. He says, "But when everything is finally overcome and attained, nothing can ever be gained but deliverance from some suffering or desire. Consequently, we are only in the same position as we were before the suffering or desire appeared." So in summary, we can see that for Schopenhauer, he thinks that the majority of human beings live in the pursuit of sensory pleasures, and that this is a futile kind of life because we're never continually satisfied. Pleasure-seeking only leads to two possible ends, either frustration or boredom. And this is why he has this pendulum, which is called a kind of pessimistic pendulum, if you will. For Schopenhauer, this cycle of this pendulum swing between boredom and frustration can only be broken if people stop seeking pleasure, stop seeking their desires, and turn towards intellectual pursuits, because intellectual ends are goods in themselves rather than means to an end. They're not just stimuli that yield a certain feeling, but most people, he believes, just can't or won't try to achieve this. Either they are incapable of seeking something that is so sort of difficult or esoteric or elevated, and even those who have the talent to do that don't have the endurance to keep it up for long. Maybe they just get tired, or maybe their body intrudes on them, they get hungry, they get sick, or practical life interrupts them, right? Some calamity or some external event. So the upshot for all of this, what does this tell us about the design of the world? It tells us that life is a cruel joke or a mistake, and that existence is filled only with either pain or with boredom. And these are signs that existence don't have any inherent meaning. Existence is empty. And in fact, the world is designed in a way that makes us miserable in one way or the other. So that's all about Arthur Schopenhauer's The Vanity and Suffering of Life. I hope this has been helpful to you and that you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking with you soon.